for Saddam's murderous aggression is only one case, and the two incidents that I just took from the Great War for Civilization, those two incidents brought Iran to the recognition that they would have to capitulate to the U.S.-Saddam alliance, to the aggression. They surely haven't forgotten that, along with much else. Well, third incident is different. It's perhaps the most moving report I've ever read by Fisk or any other journalist that I can think of, and that's his account of his flight from American bombing in Afghanistan in December 2000. He was with a crowd of people who, now quote him, were desperate and angry and mourning their newly slaughtered loved ones, slaughtered under B-52 bombs. In this crowd, he was mistaken for an American, badly beaten, tried to kill him, barely escaped with his life through the intervention of some notable, probably a mullah. I can't try to reproduce Fisk's sensitive and thoughtful account of this terrible incident. It's, of course, laced with fear and anger, but also sympathy for those who almost killed him and were trying to kill him, and understanding of what led them to that savagery. Well, this is actually one of the rare cases where Fisk did make it to the U.S. press, even to U.S. scholarship. So his account was featured by a revered moral philosopher, academic specialist on what's called just war, Jean Belke Elstein. She wrote that by daring to comprehend the reaction of refugees to someone they understandably took to share responsibility for their misery, Fisk carried absurdity to a preposterous extreme. Worse still, he was also guilty of racism for reporting that his white skin may have saved him, and that sanctifies any evil perpetrated by the oppressed race, according to Andrew Sullivan, former editor of the New Republic, who she quotes. That's the bastion of American liberal intellectual life. Its next editor went beyond that and featured the same piece, Fisk's piece, in what it calls its Idiot Watch. That's a regular listing of work that descends to pure idiocy. So the point is, they didn't have to explain it, the point is that no one but a pure idiot could believe that Afghans might not celebrate watching their children torn to shreds by noble American B-52s. Well, for full disclosure, I should add that I've made it to the same list. Now you have the unusual privilege of hearing one leading idiot introduce another member of that august company. And I can only urge that you listen carefully, and we're all certain to learn a lot that we shouldn't hear, according to our guardians. Thanks.
Noam, this could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I'm glad you were told to turn off your mobile phones, ladies and gentlemen, because some months ago in Dublin, Ireland, I said that anyone whose mobile phone rang when I was speaking would be sold into slavery. And immediately a mobile phone rang, and it was mine. So it's still on now, so you can answer your phones if you want. It's a newsroom, no problems. I'm not going to try and give you a hard sell on my book. At 1,300 pages in the English edition, it's impossible. But I will try and tell you about partly what it taught me about the Middle East to write it, and how its purpose changed, because the book I wrote is not the one I started writing. It took 20 months to do. And I think at the end of the day, while it started off trying to explain the privilege of watching history, it ended up talking about the curse of watching history. And I think the theme that came out of it for me, which I guess is the one I think about, is our need to refuse to accept the narrative of history as it is laid down by our presidents and our prime ministers and our generals and our journalists for the most part. It's also a book about my father, because 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Bill Fisk of the 12th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment, who was much older than my mum, she wasn't born at the time, was a soldier in the First World War. He was sent to the trenches of France in August 1918, just before the end of that war. And just before the end, he was also ordered to carry out the execution of a young Australian soldier, 19 years old, the same age as him, who was found guilty of killing a British military policeman in Paris. And my father, who in later years was a very conservative man, he called black people niggers, he was a racist man. He liked magistrates and capital punishment and police stations, policemen. He refused to execute his Australian comrade. And I think, looking back now, that that was one of the finest things he ever did in his life. He also refused the narrative of military life that was laid down for him. When he died, aged 93 in 1992, I inherited his campaign medals. And on the back of his 1914-1918 medal was written the words, "The Great War for Civilization." And immediately I knew that, ironically, that had to be the title of my book. Because in 17 months that followed Bill Fisk's First World War, the victors, primarily the British and the French, of course, drew the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the Middle East. And I've spent my entire professional career in Belfast and Belgrade, and we love onomatopoeia, we journalists, and Beirut and Baghdad, watching the people in these borders burn. So the book was also very much a disturbing volume to write. After the beginning of the first 200 pages, I realized that there wouldn't even be any shred of my normal black humor coming into the book. About on page 200, I record how Jon Snow, now a big anchorman on Channel 4 in Britain, and then humble reporter like me, he's still an old mate of mine, he and I, for reasons too boring to explain to you, found ourselves having to rescue the crew of a British ship which was stuck in the Shatt al-Arab River with missiles from Iran and Iraq going each side of the hull. John, with flippers, went off with a bunch of Iraqi commandos. They were the good guys at the time. We loved the Iraqis. They were invading Iran. Later on, when they invaded Kuwait, it was the wrong thing around. But in these days, they were the good guys. So he went off with the Iraqis, and I, poor old Bob, stayed on the shore in the darkness, and my job was to pull the rope attached to the lifeboat, which had been lowered from the British ship in the middle of the night, while bullets whizzed around at hip height, because all the dogs on the island, which had been abandoned by their owners, could sniff that Bob was there and were going, "Arr, arr, arr, arr," which was great if you were standing in front of the Iranian front line. Anyway, I pulled the boat over with John and the crew in. Being a British ship, most of the crew, of course, were Sri Lankan and Indian and Pakistani. And the worst moment in their lives came when Bob pulled them ashore and found that on board the boat they'd also brought all their duty-free colour televisions and refrigerators, which they'd bought in Dubai before they set off on their doomed and luckless journey to the Iran-Iraq border. And my job, which John agreed I would have to do because we had to race back across this island, which was partly underwater, was to get each colour television set and each refrigerator and chuck it back into the Shatt al-Arab River. In any event, I went down to see a dear friend of mine and sitting in my library at home as I was writing, and I said, "You know, that's the last happy story in the book." And she said, "Ah, that is the end of the sweet stories." And that is how I begin the next paragraph. So if you do read the book, when you get to there, watch out, because the rest of the book is an almost unrelieved pageant of torture, suffering, pain, betrayal, national and international treachery, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. I must say that I reached the end of this book, and this often, when I have repeated it elsewhere to American audiences, brings a drawing in of breath. When I reached the end of my book, of 80 years of duplicity, in the Middle East, I found myself amazed at how much restraint Muslims had shown towards the West. I also tried to question what our job was as foreign correspondents, what my job should be. I had a conversation more than 2 years ago with that very fine Israeli journalist Amira Haas on Haaretz about this very question. And I, being a Brit, of course, I said, oh, well, our job is to write the first pages of history so that people can never say, we didn't know, no one told us. And Amira said, no, Robert, you're wrong. Our job is to monitor the centres of power, to challenge authority, especially when they want to go to war, especially when they're going to kill people and tell lies to do it. And that, I think, is the best definition I've ever heard of what our job should be in my life. And it's now the definition I use, always, of course, copywriting it to Amira. But there is a big problem. And it's one of the things, the main thing I want to talk to you about today, and maybe hear you and even Noam again on this same subject. And that is, how do we get it so wrong? How do we get it, we journalists, how do we manage not to inform you? I've always thought it's remarkable. I mean, Noam says I don't have a regular column in an American paper. Here is the man who should have a regular column in an American paper. And so should the late Edward Said have had a regular column in an American paper. And shame upon the American media that they didn't have and don't have. What's gone wrong in the American press? I ask myself this partly because I have a lot of friends among the American journalists working in the Middle East. I enjoy having dinner with them. But the odd thing is that when I'm at dinner with them, I learn quite a lot. They know a lot. But when I open the paper in the morning, it's so boring I could fall asleep. The knowledge isn't there. I remember my colleague Patrick Coburn in Baghdad telling me that at one point of great violence in Baghdad, he saw an American colleague crawling out on his balcony to use his satellite phone to talk to somebody. And afterwards he said, what? Because there were a lot of bullets flying around. What was the problem? Who were you talking to? He said, I was ringing someone up at the Brookings Institution. We needed a quote about what was going on in Iraq. You see the problem? I mean, there is this osmotic, parasitic relationship which your journalists, and some of ours too, have with power. You only have to watch, I was going to say watch CNN, don't watch CNN. You only have to watch a presidential press conference from the White House to see how the relationship works. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. Yes, Bob. Yes, John. See, that's how it works. Close to power, have access. When I was doing a book launching tour, and by the way, it's getting really, I've done New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, Norway, and here in 1.5 weeks. So if I seem to be wandering at any point, I am. I'm sitting in LA having my morning coffee, and I open my Los Angeles Times, which will show you I was in LA on November the 16th, 2005. I'm going to show you one of the problems with your journalism, okay? This is a story on the front page, which you can see. In a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind, we love masterminds, don't we, stays a step ahead of the United States. By Josh Meyer and Mark Mazzetti, Times staff writers, Washington. Good place to write about Iraq from, by the way. Try it. The first paragraph, despite the recent arrest of one of his would-be suicide bombers in Jordan and some top aides in Iraq, insurgency mastermind Abu Musab Zarqawi, he might not even be alive for all I know, has eluded capture, US authorities say, because his network has a much better intelligence gathering operation than they do. Wow. Now, first of all, I don't think Zarqawi may be even alive, and I doubt very much if he's got much of an intelligence gathering operation. The problem is that when you set off on an ideological war, you can have all the mainframe computers you like, and as much HUMINT as you like, and as big CIA central station as you want. If it's an ideological war, you won't understand what you're listening to. I'll give you a perfect example of that. 5 weeks before the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, Bin Laden made an audio tape which no one listened to. What we did, we said, and the Pentagon said, and the press said, was it him? Is he ill? How long ago did he make the broadcast finish?